everyone. Thank you for joining us at this e-symposium. Today, we are going to be talking about sporting resilience during COVID-19. The symposium is based on a qualitative research project conducted during the first wave of the national lockdowns in March to May 2020. This is Sahen Gupta speaking and presenting, and my research partner on this study is Dr. Paul Makati, and both of us are at Glasgow Caledonian University. We explored two distinct topics. Firstly, what was the nature of this adversity caused by COVID-19? And secondly, how are competitive elite athletes adapting? And together, they form the topic of this symposium, which is what we are going to be talking about, sporting resilience during COVID-19. So let us start with a brief overview of the symposium. After an introduction to the background and to the variables studied, we will move on to the method and the findings. And lastly, and most importantly, applied practice implications are going to be discussed. Now, the primary aim of this symposium is to give applied practitioners a lived experience insight of the lives of athletes during the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated lockdowns, including in all of its impacts on sport per se, because as we know now, there's another form of lockdown available, and this holds relevance in how we support athletes now and moving on to the near future. So, the background of this study was obviously centered around the impact of COVID-19, which has caused worldwide industry closure and during lockdowns inhibited all forms of sporting activity. The findings of previous studies have indicated that 20+ hours a day at home is causing chronic stress exposure, depressive symptoms, and elevated anxiety levels. And in terms of sport, international tournaments slated for the year, such as the Euro 2020, the Olympics, were either postponed or cancelled due to travel, social distancing restrictions, and for the general safety of not only the athletes and the sporting community, but also larger society as a whole. All of this has caused a substantial impact of COVID on all levels of sport. Now, after the postponement of international tournaments, athletes have had responses ranging from constructive all the way to debilitative. Some reactions include intrinsic motivation and identity development outside of sport, the more adaptive or positive sides of things. The more negative and not very adaptive or maladaptive symptoms would include burnout syndromes, feelings of alienation, poor coping compounded by social isolation. Now, this social isolation and the COVID disruption has caused a form of dissociation in the athlete's career, triggering dissociations from the larger athletic identity as well, because sport was taken away from them, including all things associated with sports, such as competing, training, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we agree with Samuel et al. 2020's conceptualization of COVID-19 as a change event in the athlete's career. And in addition to being a change event, we have also considered COVID to be a chronic adversity experience, since it is a state of hardship associated with distress and difficulty for the athletes in this study involved. The resilience is the primary focus of the study, and resilience as a word has been often used by the media and the government officials throughout the world, worldwide, during this pandemic because of simply of what it means. Resilience comes from the Latin word resiliere, which means to leap back or bounce back or adapt after an adversity. But let's look at the psychological variants of resilience and how that is defined. Now, resilience in sport started with the study and the definition by Fletcher and Sarkar in 2012, who provided the grounded theory investigation, compounding in concluding resilience to be the role of mental processes, behavior in promoting personal assets and protecting an individual from the potential negative effect of stressors. Now, Gupta and Makati in 2020 conducted a systematic review of all resilience literature in sport and came to a theoretical synthesis of all components of resilience studied in literature which have evidence backing. And from that, they formulated the definition of sporting resilience to be the environmentally adaptable, interaction dominant, dynamic, process trajectory that encompasses a sporting individual's metacognitive, emotional, behavioral capacities to maintain a positive equilibrium and to successfully adapt to sport-related adversities. Now, to better understand the focus of the investigation and to better situate it, we first explored the nature of the adversity. What was the difficulty essentially? What was the subjective experience of this new adversity of lockdowns and related disruptions caused by COVID? And then we sought to understand the complexity of the resilient process of resilience adaptation during COVID-19. And these two are interrelated but mutually distinct processes, because without the adversity, there's no need to engage in resilience. And that's why we wanted to first understand what the adversity was and how that was experienced. And then we wanted to look at, based on that, what was the resilience process engaged in. The study was contained within the paradigm of ontological relativism. Essentially, it was centered on the idea that athletes experienced COVID-19 reality differently and subjectively to one another. We explored the lived experience of adversity and the unfolding of resilience through the narrative analysis of their experiences. Hermeneutical differences and authenticity were prized throughout so that we could achieve this, because even though COVID-19 was a societal and a common factor, every individual experienced it differently based on where they were, how they could adapt based on what resources they have, and therefore for that relevance we wanted to go for the ontological relativism perspective in the study. Now, we engaged in a purposive sampling and competitive elite athletes were chosen. According to the formal classification of Swan et al. 2015, competitive elite athletes are those who consistently compete and have had success at the elite or international level. All the participants were from countries where national lockdowns were implemented and engaged in team or individual sports. Some sports which were included in the sample included curling, basketball, netball, golf, slaloming, and badminton, among others. Now, we first had a phase 1 screening, since study 2 or the second half was focused on uncovering the process of resilience. We used the brief resilience form to check for the above normal threshold of self-reported resilience, because only when participants would be self-reporting a high level of resilience would they be really engaged to share their experiences of how they engaged in that resilience process, rather than participants or athletes who did not self-evaluate themselves or self-report themselves to have high resilience. And phase 2 involved inviting the participants to interviews using Microsoft Teams. 10 competitive elite athletes were finally interviewed, 5 females and 5 males, and athletes included from countries such as Scotland, Ireland, England, Gibraltar, Australia, and India. There was a very specific focus to try and understand the global nature as well, to see if there were commonalities or differences from athletes across different countries. Now, prominent sporting countries, I should say, such as the US, Brazil, Russia, were excluded because of no strict universal national lockdowns. After inviting the participants, the interviews themselves were semi-structured and experiential in nature, where we encouraged the participants to share their lived experiences of COVID-19 in terms of what adversity and how it was, and then how they engaged in resilience to adapt following this adversity. To understand the nature of the adversity, which was essentially study 1, we analyzed the participant interviews using narrative thematic analysis. Both the subjective content and the macro context were noted, since COVID-19 is a societal level phenomena which has differing and individually specific impacts as well. The goal was to tell the whole story of the lived experience of the adversity. and we tried to preserve the sequencing of the events as much as possible in terms of reflecting the temporal elements of the experiences of the adversity in terms of what came first, what came after, and so on and so forth. The first and overwhelmingly consistent theme in the participant narrative was of loss. The loss of sport, loss of support, loss of identity. Loss was seen to be a major underpinning of the adversity. This feeling of losing a sense of normality with the loss of their sport was echoed by everyone. And the losing of normality which the rest of society experienced as well was also actively a part of the adversity experience of athletes. I mean, as one of the participants said, I've never had 8 weeks where I have not stepped on a badminton court. So it's weird because competitive elite athletes do have that rigorous structure of training and competition which they adhere to at all costs. Even if they're injured, they have a rehabilitation specific plan for that sense. So losing all of that would have an impact on losing their anchor across which their daily lives were situated around. And this was compounded by the fact that training and the competitive schedules which they were used to were suddenly no more, as the quote says. Now, this loss of support and training also caused negative emotions and adjustment problems because this caused frustration due to the impact of COVID on their sport and by extension on their training as well. Participants were used to state-of-the-art training facilities, medical facilities, interpersonal communication and support, all of which were lost. And loss of sport and training had a consequent impact on psychological sport enjoyment because sport was a place where participants expressed themselves, was a core enjoyment factor in their daily lives as well. To highlight the lived experiences of adversities, to give applied practitioners a sense of almost being there, we brought some of the direct quotes along. There is a distinct problem in terms of the lack of structure compounded with the uncertainty of the future, which has had a clear impact. And if you look at it, they've struggled with many different things. They've struggled and it seemed almost impossible, primarily because there's a feeling of being overwhelmed, resulting to the compromise and choosing of what to do and how to train with the very limited resources available. And the loss of goals in terms of the long-term goals and the long-term structure was also clearly highlighted, as one of the participants said, my problem is I don't really have any goals at the moment and there's nothing to look forward to. And the loss of the positive sporting environment and the diverse support that came with it was also a key part which was affected due to the lockdowns and the whole nature of the COVID-19 adversity. Another common theme which recurred throughout the narrative was a sense of incongruence. Now, incongruence represented a form of dissonance, as I've said before, between the usual structured, goal-directed 1, 2, 3 environment, so to speak, that they are acclimatized to, and the relative aimlessness and the relative freedom or the lack of structure which COVID-19 isolation brought. This incongruence was, of course, made worse by the sense of loss and the very real and tangible loss as well, because it ended into a place where it was very hard to motivate themselves because there was nothing to work towards. There's no sense of certainty about the future because they don't know where tournaments are going to happen again. They don't know how they're going to happen again, when they're going to get back into training, and how they're going to train in the meantime as well. And this in conflict between an ideal self of being a perfect athlete and a real self where they were actually struggling was something which came across very, very clearly, causing psychological distress and anxiety. This led to a discrepancy in performance expectations since the training level did not match the expected training level which they are used to. And this was debilitating, or they were perceiving it to be debilitating because they would lose their elite level performance. And there's a constant need to live up to the ideal perception of what they should be, whereas what they're actually struggling with. So one of the recommendations for applied practitioners was a management of this by re-engineering long-term outcome goals to a more short-term outcome goals focused via goal setting as well. And this re-engineering could reflect the COVID-19 and lockdown reality and the new normal, so to speak. By setting process goals which maintain fitness and performance and psychological stability in the short term and work towards those things while maintaining performance and mental health, but by changing outcome goals which are far ahead into the future, which are long-term developmental goals which might not be very realistic for them to accept because the future in and of itself seems so uncertain. So that could be one way where applied practitioners could be attempting to reduce this dissonance and this effect of incongruence based on the adversity that they are experiencing. Because of government regulations and also the safety of all involved, we can't really do a lot about the sense of loss except work on a way of acceptance towards it, which is what we're going to be talking on into the next half of this presentation as well. Which brings us to the second study, which is to understand the resilient process. And based on that, we can obviously help athletes deal with this adversity. Now, we employed a narrative structural quest analysis. Now, in a standard quest structure, the plot revolved around meeting adversity that COVID-19 caused, accepting it, and developing or adapting to it, which closely reflects the trajectory of resilient adaptation proposed by Bonanno and Dimich, 2013. All participants engaged in a positive reframing and challenge appraisal, which signaled the start of their facilitative resilience response. And this is partly because all participants self-reported that they had higher resilience and they were adapting or in the process of adapting to this adversity. Because of the acute and unprecedented nature of COVID-19 adversity, no participated, reported, or reflected the progression of resilience along the minimal impact trajectory, which we're going to be talking about right now. Now, the minimal impact resilience trajectory, as you can see, is the one which goes straight through, so to speak, this trajectory. Now, when past experience and extant personal resources make easy work of an adversity, and this leads to the direct trajectory to positive adaptation, that's usually characterized as the standard minimal impact resilience trajectory. This is a common phenomena when there is a high sense of control and past experience regarding to it. And obviously, in COVID-19, there was a very, very low sense of control, compounded by that feeling of incongruence and that loss, as we discussed previously in the study. And there's no precedent for this in lived experience of any of the athletes. So therefore, the minimal impact resilience was not something which was accessible. Instead, athletes engaged in the emergent resilience trajectory. And this was characterized by the 4 stages of the trajectory. The first one was disruption. Disruption of normality. Disruption of what they were used to. Disruption caused by the loss. The second one was the depletion of their resources. As we talked about, the adversity was characterized by the loss of support, loss of their sporting environment that they were used to. Then a third level is metacognitive evaluation and facilitative learning, which was a key to the start of the resilient process, to start relearning, re-evaluating, figuring out what they could do and re-engage new resources to do so. And this learning eventually compounds with new resources and a rebound, which eventually leads to positive adaptation. Now, this is Bonanno and Dimich's theory, which has been adapted by Gupta and McCarthy for the sporting context as well in press. And we're going to be framing the resilience process or the structure of the quest of resilience in terms of this trajectory of adaptation. Now, the emergent trajectory of resilience is characterized, as I said, by stage 1, disruption. This was a recurring feature in the narrative because of the hugely interruptive nature of COVID-19 adversity across all sectors of life, which included sport. As you can see, we're all going through a bad time. Sport has stopped. That has been unusual because I'm so used to getting up early and going to the course, but not now. And this loss, this is reflective of the loss. This is reflective of the loss of sport, of the loss of support. And specifically talking to the loss of support, we have stage 2, the depletion of resources, which is linked to the loss of support and stability brought about by the adversity. Now the teams can't train together anymore. Support staff can't give that support that they usually give. Coaches can't interact with their athletes, athletes can't interact with their team. And it's been a very real loss, as one of the participants said, but also a slow moving away from that loss to a sense of acceptance, a realization that this is not going to be forever, which leads to stage 3, a metacognitive evaluation and learning. This was characterized by a re-evaluation of and acceptance of this unnatural reality. Metacognitive appraisal, which is essentially appraising your own thought process and your own evaluations on a situation, included looking beyond the individual adversity and looking at the larger world, because after all, COVID-19 was a planetary phenomenon. As participant says, we're all going through a bad time, and my resilience has allowed me to have that positive perspective to think that it's not just me. And we will recover from this. So it's also very key to the challenge appraisal, which is key to the resilience process, because after the acceptance, there's a challenge of how can we reevaluate, relearn, and move on from this with new resources and be prepared, so to speak. This has led to stage 4, which is the rebound with new resources. So once the challenge appraisal kicked in after the acceptance, athletes sort of engaged in a learning to utilize and mobilize what they have or their available resources in an innovative manner, which was facilitated by previous adaptability experiences in elite sport. So athletes got to thinking about what they've done in sport so far, or what sport has given them in terms of adversity. The whole journey that you take, it builds character and personality, and it makes you stronger mentally and physically. And this was the journey of the sporting career that the athlete was talking about, which gave them experiences to utilize some of the resources that they've developed over sporting careers at the international level. This learning and development of new resources for future experience was also based on the experience and adaptation of this adversity. As one participant said, very key to the challenge appraisal and rebound with new resources, and she actually succinctly summarized it saying, I feel like we're all going to come out of this with different perspectives on how much we rely on sport to happen and how much on our sport to keep ourselves going. And it's going to be a good thing by the end of it, but between now and then, obviously, there's not very good things in the middle. The core elements of the findings suggest that COVID-19 pandemic has forced an obligatory hiatus. And this obligatory hiatus is very similar in the onset and the experience of a forced retirement. So that's a very helpful way of conceptualizing this adversity. An adversity where there's not a lot of resources on, because it's a very new and a very fresh adversity. And therefore, conceptualizing the experience similar to a forced retirement will give applied practitioners some avenues of conceptualizing interventions and better help clients. The anticipatory emotions and consequences have led to choices that maximize harm as per the risk is feeling hypotheses. So just anticipating the emotions and consequences have led to choices. Athletes have been engaging in that protective behavior in that sense. So there's an anticipation that I'm going to feel this way. There's an anticipation that I'm going to be treated that way, which has been rewarding back through their behaviors in terms of the risk and feeling hypotheses. So a referral to that in terms of a frame of reference in terms of dealing with clients could be another helpful way to guide applied practice. Now, COVID-19 is a non-normative adversity, and this is a very, very important distinction, because non-normative adversities is non-normal adversities. And in this case, in terms of resilience and adaptation, it's very key because there is no prior experience. This is reduced sense of mastery, which is key to resilience. And protective resources such as social support and facilitative environments are absent most of the time. And even though they are present, they're present in a digital or a different mean. So applied practice must be cognizant of this and treat COVID-19 and the related psychological distress as a non-normative adversity, and therefore, so to speak, think outside the box of the paradigm as Wheely suggested in 2006 to tailor interventions, being cognizant of the fact that usual protective factors are not usually and readily available due to this. And the last and most important finding that we realized is that the resilience process is ongoing simply because the adversity is ongoing. The athletes have no environmental cues, just like the rest of society doesn't really have an environmental cue reliably indicating that the threat is over. In recent times, such as last week when I'm recording this in the end of November, there have been some vaccines which have reported successes, but the vaccine is still not on the market. And the risk of catching COVID, being infected with it, and having health consequences is a very real threat as well, which is explained by the second wave of lockdowns in many of the countries. And therefore, practitioners need to be consistent and cognizant of that the adversity is still very much there. And therefore, what we do needs to reflect that. Applied practice implications are a key part, and we are going to be talking about how engaging the resilience process, one of the key things would be building a sense of mastery. One strategy to do so would be drawing evidence from sporting careers which have prevented engagement or which have prevented sporting engagement, such as reinforcing the process of adaptation they engaged in when they had injuries, when they had a severe debilitative career drawback, when they had a loss in a major championship final. So any adversity experiences they've gone through and they've developed out of it and adapted out of it, a reflection process based on that and drawing evidence from that, maybe using Socratic questioning, would be a very helpful way to balance and give a sense of reinforcement that they do have the resources to combat this. To promote a shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset which improves resilience, because athletes need to be aware that this is an evolving situation. So instead of a fixed mindset, there should be a growth mindset to roll with the changes, so to speak. And focus should be on development and maintenance rather than overt markers such as results, because they focus on developing towards a goal in the future, and that future is a very unstable reality as of now. The lived experiences of athletes reflect their daily struggle to be a perfect athlete versus considering that they too are a victim of the pandemic. Training and psychological support should be cognizant of this fact. And the facilitation of self-regulation abilities of athletes is a very important thing. So by self-regulation training and environmental mastery, there could be a balance of self-care and performance, which would eventually contribute to resilience in athletes. Lastly, sports psychologists must remember that for the foreseeable future, athletes will continue to deal with the chronic COVID-19 adversity. The adversity is there and here to stay for the next few months at least. In such a context, simple is sufficient. Principles of care, empathy, personal growth, and unconditional positive regard should form the foundations of practice, and performance enhancement should only be undertaken after the fact of this psychosocial stability at the individual level and evaluated constantly as per such situation mandates. So thank you for attending. Stay safe, stay well, and if you have any questions or any other ways that we can help you out, do contact us. It was a pleasure, although it would have been even better presenting in person. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in.